colleague of mine was saying, let's explore insulin resistance and let's look at what it is. And this is what hyperinsulinemia is. And in diabetes, you get typically type 2 diabetes, you have insulin resistance. And we're all in agreement. And then why do dietitians prescribe moderate to high carbohydrate diets to manage type 2 diabetes, a condition where you can't actually manage your carbohydrates well? It's such a simple question. And I was absolutely stumped. Once you see something, you can't unsee it. And once you hear something, you can't unhear it. I was kind of in two minds about carrying on as a dietitian. And that kind of started me on my journey. Elevated levels of insulin in the blood are disease-causing, disease-promoting. And how do we keep insulin high? Carry on eating carbohydrates. And if you look back to the 50s, the diet that was promoted for diabetes was pretty much a whole food, low carb diet. I don't know where we went wrong with that, but we went from being right to then being wrong, and we're trying to now right the wrongs.
Caryn, when you're working with a client and they want to lose weight, and I'm guessing part of the foundational work you're going to do is look at their diet and make some changes within that, but take me through that process.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before, but that's good. I love it. So I guess everyone conducts their consultation quite differently. So from where to go, I think it's really important to get some information, to get as much information from a client or patient as you possibly can before they connect with you. So I get them to do a comprehensive pre-screen form that I see beforehand, so I get a good feel as much as you can on paper about what their history is, what their goals are, what medical history, diet history, all that kind of stuff. So when I meet with them for the first time, like if you were a patient now, I'd be looking at you and I'd know all sorts of things about you before we start, and then we start having the conversation and you fill in the gaps, and often there's a lot that's left out on paper, so you get to find out a lot more. And I guess my main, it's quite tricky to make sure that you are totally on point with what a client wants, and often you have to balance that with what their goal is. And also what you provide them on the first consultation. I'm a private practice dietitian amongst being an academic, and I'm aware that people are paying me, so I need to give them a good service. And a lot of that service is revolving around what we talk about, how we talk, building rapport, which is really important, and then what they're provided with at the end of the consultation. I don't do the here's a 6-week plan, send, Monday, 8:00, I need to eat this, that, and the other. So in the consultation itself, once we've discussed what the client goals are, together we kind of negotiate our way forward in terms of what is suggested. I don't want to say prescribed, that sounds pretty crazy, but in some cases it is. But what is discussed in terms of how the client and the context can move forward and meet the goal based on the diet and lifestyle needs that are required to take them there. So I would imagine you're aware my general philosophy, my bottom line is whole food. And depending on what the patient wants, whether it's, or what they've got, weight loss, diabetes, polycystic ovary, gut issues, whatever, it tends to be towards that carbohydrate reduction philosophy, generally not because I slap everyone on it, but basically because people eat too many carbohydrates in general. And I think most people, if not everyone, can benefit by taking out some of those highly processed carbohydrate foods and focus more on carbohydrate quality, but also quantity. So we talk diet, we talk lifestyle, we talk exercise, we talk stress. There's a lot to discuss in a 1-hour consultation. So again, it's that balance between getting the client to talk, but getting them to listen as well. And then after the consultation, which is all online, I don't do face-to-face anymore, thanks to COVID. And afterwards, I type up their plan and their strategies and send it through to them. And then on follow-up, we kind of do more of that health coaching type of approach to see how they're going. So that's kind of the semi-long short story to what happens in a consultation.
All right. So to make sure I have the diet part right, real food is the very top. Coming down from there, we want to remove processed carbs. And it sounds like decreasing carbs in general. For somebody that's eating a standard type diet, they want to lose, say, 20 plus pounds. How do you determine how far down you bring the carbs?
Brilliant question. I think it's a negotiated process partly, but it's also being able to read where they're at. So if someone is, I get them to complete what we call a 24-hour recall beforehand, so I can get a gauge. I know it's only one day, but the conversation helps as well. You get a gauge as to where someone's at, and typically there's eating 6 or more times a day: breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, after dinner, and somewhere along the lines it usually falls apart. Usually afternoon tea or after dinner, and if someone is just there for weight loss and they don't have pre-diabetes, diagnosed type 2 diabetes, or any other conditions characterized by insulin resistance, and they're on a very high carbohydrate diet and it's looking pretty messy, I tend to go, so we talk about it. We talk about what carbohydrate reduction looks like. And I think the important thing is, and you might be aware in the industry, there's been a lot of move in terminology from low carb, keto, right through to carbohydrate restriction. And now the shift is towards carbohydrate reduction. I really like that terminology. It's more gentle and it's more, it's more gentle, and I think it's appropriate. Anyway, so I would probably talk to them about what a ketogenic diet looks like, the extreme end, down by 20 grams of carbohydrate. I say to them, you're probably at 250, 300, 400 grams of carbohydrate maybe. What have you done before? How's that worked? A lot of my clients go, I've done keto and it really worked for me. I'm like, well, then if it worked for you, why are we talking now? So I get a lot of clients that have done keto and they just can't manage it long term. So they're back in the consultation seat. So I like to hang in that low carb space, which might be anywhere between 50 and 150 grams of carbohydrate. Most of the time I narrow it down, might go between 50 and 80, might go between 80 and 120. And these are my nutrition literate clients. So I get them to, because they'll go, well, what does 120 grams of carbohydrate look like? Well, great question. You're going to figure this out, and we're going to talk through it. So for someone who is nutrition literate, we talk about the grams and the details. For somebody who says, just tell me what to eat, that's what I do, but I kind of pitch it around, between 50 and 100 grams. I find that level of carbohydrate reduction, this is a very general rule, but that's what we work with. As a general rule, I find that moderate carbohydrate reduction is way more sustainable. Sometimes you can go a little bit higher, sometimes you can go a little bit lower. That might differ for someone who's got true carbohydrate addiction and sugar addiction, because the science and the practice is moving towards abstinence for some people of carbohydrates. So that might look a lot lower, more towards the ketogenic end. But again, it's a discussion and it's a negotiated process.
And for somebody who's coming from a standard type diet, say 300 grams-ish of carbs a day, do you like to do that gently if you're going to bring them down to that 50 to 100 gram range? Do you find that people transition better that way? I would assume going slow but sure would be an easier transition. But talk about how you think about that. Is it better just to rip the Band-Aid or take them down slowly?
Yeah, you ask such interesting questions. This is great. It's very, again, it's a balance, and it's also personality driven, but it's also, this is tricky because sometimes it's about value for money that they want to get out of that consultation. So I might say this is where, this is how it typically happens. Maybe sit between, just for weight loss, between maybe 80 and 100 grams of carbohydrate. And if they're on 300, you could say anything lower, moving towards, this is progress. So it's up to you. And we do get a gauge in the discussion when we start talking about what that actually looks like in terms of food. I ask them what they can do. So it's very much a questioning process to see, like, here's some breakfast ideas. What do you think's doable for you? Oh yeah, I love omelets, but I can only make them on weekends. But every weekend I would make an omelet. And then if they are really resistant to giving up toast, then I might, I get that loud and clear. So if they don't want to change to a low carbohydrate bread, which, never is quite the same, we might build in a toast and protein-based breakfast for a couple of days of the week in transition. So it's very much about what the person is open to doing. And we talk very much about, what we do now, going down towards where you want to be is perfectly fine. But what we don't want to do is go right down and then add the carbohydrate back, because I just don't see the logic in that. And we talk about how these changes are going to be lifelong changes. So this is not a 3-month plan. It's not a let's get some weight off you so you can fit into a wedding dress and then just bulge back to where you are now. It's, if you really want to lose weight and keep it off long term, this might be the last series of conversations that we have. Let's make it the last series of conversations that we have. How does this become sustainable for you? And that's kind of how we get to where we get to. So it's about the rapport and the conversation that's really important there.
Where I'm coming out with that is from the angle of metabolic inflexibility. So somebody who's used to having, again, around that range of 300 grams of carbs a day, say they're snacking every couple of hours to continue to burn that sugar throughout the day, and then they come see you and they start on a low carb diet, I could see how they'd be pretty miserable with that transition phase. So I'm just wondering, for compliance and easing somebody into it, how much of a concern is that?
It doesn't seem to be a problem, because I've got a real philosophy about building healthy habits. And typically why they are talking to me is because they don't have great habits. And snacking is a really bad habit. I think it's quite different when you've got you've got a certain client, maybe an athlete, that needs to snack a bit more regularly, and that's a different conversation. But a lot of people eat because they just, because it's kind of societal time to eat. Morning tea goes and, it's time to eat. And a lot of people eat because the industry has guided them there to do things like keep your metabolism up, whatever that means. So they come with these preconceived ideas. And sometimes I think the first consultation with some people can be a bit brutal, in that I say, what I'd really love you to try and do is to go with 3 meals a day for starters, maybe discussion around intermittent fasting and the occasional 2 meals a day might come later on. But it's, if you're eating 6 times a day, maybe you can just focus on eating 3 meals a day. How does that sound to you? And the conversation then guides to what that might look like. If they go, I don't know if I can do that. Can I? So we build in a snack as needed. But if they go, yep, this is perfect, this is exactly what I need, then it's not really going from being metabolically inflexible to becoming metabolically more flexible. It's not like you're going to die on the spot, really. It's a few days of feeling maybe a little bit uncomfortable. But, people come to me and they say, this is my goal. And I always say, you might feel a little bit hungry. You might get a little bit of what's known as keto flu if we go as low as 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate. But typically, if we're hanging that 80 to 100 grams, it's not really a problem for people. I don't find it's a problem for people. So, and no one's told me that it's a brutal approach. Maybe they say that behind my back, but they tend to come back. So it seems to be fine.
You talked about that preconceived notion a lot of people have coming to you where they feel like they need to eat throughout the day to keep their metabolism stoked and keep it ignited. What other preconceived notions do you have to dispel when you're working with somebody coming to you?
The classic one would have to be without carbohydrate and without food. So regarding intermittent fasting, you get tired, hungry, and stupid. Your brain doesn't work without carbohydrate. You can't exercise without carbohydrate. And you feel really hungry. And I think, and those are preconceived ideas, and potentially if you're on a high carbohydrate diet and you're eating 6 times a day, and then suddenly you cut out your snacks, you will feel hungry. Because in that context of a carb-centric dietary approach, your body is relying on getting those carbohydrates for you to feel good, and for you to kind of keep going with your blood sugar doing what it's doing. So as it's peaking and troughing, you need to keep that, as you say, that fire stoked with carbohydrate. And that's a preconceived idea, which is kind of true. But when they start switching the types of foods that they eat, which typically ends up being obviously less carbohydrate, better quality carbohydrate, but more protein and more fat, not substantially more fat, but probably more than they would be used to, or the guidelines sort of tell us to have, with more protein and fat and vegetable-based meals, they realize that they actually don't feel hungry in between meals. So there goes that, I don't really need to snack all the time. A conversation about metabolism and what influences muscle mass, building or retention, and what influences metabolic rate and all that kind of stuff. They realize that they don't need to keep snacking every minute of the day. And then it's when they do it for a couple of weeks, like, wow, I thought I'd be really hungry and I thought I'd be craving this, that, and the other. But, they come back with the usual things like feel satiated, feel even energy over the day. I can sleep is good. I feel more in charge and in control and not so reliant on food. And then when we dispel the myths of intermittent fasting, that's the biggest one. Like, oh my goodness, can't eat for the whole day. I'm going to be really, I need to concentrate today. And they come back and they go, wow, concentration's been way better than ever. That's kind of a major breakthrough. So myths are continue to be dispelled during consultations.
If you're enjoying this episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. Talk more about that intermittent fasting piece, because this is a tool that can be used to really improve someone's metabolic health pretty quickly. Where along the journey with somebody do you bring that in? Does it happen along with bringing the carbs down, or do you like to do one before the other and not bring too much in at once?
Yep, it's again very, very dependent on the conversation, what the client has done before, what has worked for them. So I think a clue to future success is to really just have a conversation and say, what has worked for you before? And they go, oh yeah, intermittent fasting has worked. So it's worked, but it hasn't continued to work. Otherwise you wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's a tool you can bring up. How soon you can bring it up really depends on, you get the sense of where someone is at. And I always ask people, do you think you'll be able to do this? And sometimes clients say, what about intermittent fasting? And sometimes when I sense that they just have been really, really struggling with building healthy habits, that's key. If they're struggling with building healthy habits, then I would probably leave it till later on. I want them to build some solid healthy habits in eating areas, in lifestyle areas, exercise, stress management. So there's a lot of discussion around that. And then I might bring in intermittent fasting for that person. Once they've nailed the first kind of, low-hanging fruit, basic stuff, I might bring that in later on. sometimes I would start with intermittent fasting when somebody comes to you and they go, I want to lose weight. I am, 65 kilos. I'm not sure what that is in pounds, but I'm sure we can work it out quite quickly. They're light, okay? So they weigh very little, but they still want to lose 5 or 6 kilos. They say, I used to be 6 kilos lower than I am now. I'm eating really well. I can see they're eating really well. We have some discussions, and the treats are few and far between. So everything's looking kind of perfect, and that's a great time to bring in intermittent fasting. And there's intermittent fasting and intermittent fasting. I think some people go, okay, well, if I miss breakfast and it feels good one day a week, then therefore I need to do it every day of the week. So I don't really agree with that. I like to mix it up a little bit because, again, whatever they do now, I think they need to continue to do to get the results that they will get. Otherwise, they'll revert. So we start quite small and slow. Missing a breakfast meal typically once or twice a week. Sometimes we do a one meal a day once a week, and that's really decided by them. I might give some suggestions and they go, oh, that would really work for me because Monday I'm really, really busy and I'm kind of charging around kids and work. And gosh, if I don't have to think about breakfast, lunch, that's brilliant. But don't do that every day kind of thing. So it's very, very governed by the conversation and where people are at. But it's a great tool. It's a great tool to get small amounts of weight loss off and keep it off, but also to assist getting large amounts of weight off as well.
How do you look at that as a long-term tool for somebody that is at their goal weight and they just want to use it as part of their healthy routine to maintain metabolic health? It sounds like there's some variance there person to person, but just to give a ballpark idea, somebody like yourself that's metabolically healthy and at their goal weight, how do you use that as a tool throughout the week?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm particularly, for me, it's not really about goal weight. I want to gain more muscle, and that will probably be more weight. So I want to actually be a little bit heavier. And I know, it's interesting. Someone like me, I'd think, well, and it depends on the age and stage as well. So for a lot of people who I deal with, it's kind of middle-aged women, and protein is a very important nutrient for that age and stage. And I think if you can build and retain as much muscle after the age of 35 or 40 moving up, then you standing yourself in good stead later on. And I think that sometimes intermittent fasting, and there's a lot of debate about this, but I think sometimes the more you do, the more you risk that muscle mass gain or retention. So you've got to be very clear and very careful about how that operates. So you could do intermittent fasting for weight loss, so that wouldn't be the situation we talked about now. You could do intermittent fasting for optimal health gain. So you could maybe do, a 24-hour fast once a month or something, just to kind of get that little bit of an extended period of autophagy, catabolism, but not on a daily basis when it might compromise where you're at in your muscle mass goals if you have muscle mass goals. So using it for weight loss, but using it for health. It's interesting. Advanced fasting is something I don't do a lot with my clients, but I talk about it every now and again. Every now and again I get a client who goes, I just want to prevent the nasty diseases and I want to do the best for my body. And that's when we potentially talk more about more substantial fasts. So maybe once every few months, they might do a 48 to a 72-hour fast to optimize that autophagy, to upregulate that ketone signaling, BDNF, proliferation in the brain, all the benefits of that. So we might talk about that in a way that's not going to put their general goals or their muscle mass at compromise. And I know there is some debate about at what point do you lose muscle mass? And maybe after, around 3 days you might, but then at that point, growth hormone kicks in and we get to 5 days and you don't lose muscle mass. And so that still needs to be played out, I think. But I do think it's a tool that people can use. I also think it's a great tool for people who are metabolically healthy, who are particular about their diets and the routine. So I say I'm fairly particular about my diet and routine. I kind of like to make sure that I know what I'm going to be eating. My fridge looks like I want it to look. My cupboard looks like I want it to look. But every now and again, things kind of turn to custard, and rushing to work, and I'm like, haven't made my lunch or something. Go to work, the options are not great. Great opportunity to do some intermittent fasting. So I just do that. And then when I get myself organized again, which is only probably a few hours later, I'm back to healthy eating. So you can use it when you find yourself in a situation where the food that you're exposed to, you don't really want to choose because it's just not in line with what your goals are. So that's another way to use that, provided it doesn't happen on a daily basis. So you've got to be fairly well organized.
You mentioned...
Does that answer your question?
No, that's great. But you mentioned ketone signaling there, which perked my ears. For somebody that's doing a lot of what we talked about today, bringing the carbs down, maybe getting into some intermittent fasting, they're likely, at least at points, going to enter ketosis. Talk about that ketone signaling piece and how you feel about the benefit of having ketones, at least intermittently, and the benefits they can get from that.
Yeah, look, the more I read about ketones and its effects, systemic effect around the body, the more I think, they're good things, right? They're good things, and we should have them there. Can you have them there all the time? Yeah, you can, but you've got to live in quite an extreme way to do that. And I think maybe, 1% of the population can do that. And then you could do some cycling, I guess. So if you are living in a moderately low carb space, I think it's good from time to time to push the boundaries and to get your carbs low, or to do some intermittent fasting, as you say, to get a high level of ketones circulating. Now, what is the optimal amount of ketone signaling, or of circulating ketones that you need to prevent diseases, to optimize all these amazing things? We don't know. We really don't know. There's a lot we don't know about ketones. We've got different ways to measure them. What's better? Blood, urine, breath ketones. We're kind of navigating our way there. But in terms of the expression of them systemically, we don't know. And I think if you're dealing with the average individual who wants to live for as long as they can, as well as they can, but they also want to enjoy the niceties of life, go on holiday, they've got families, all that kind of stuff. It's just how you pitch it. So I like to sell the concept of if you can get some signaling every now and again, however you choose to do it, I think it will be beneficial for you long term. So it's about the conversation and how we weave it in. I think I'd love to have more ketones more regularly, but I just like food too much, and I probably don't get as much as I would like, and I've got to get into that to the right mindset to do that, and that involves setting up your mind right. And, which is some effort.
And for somebody like you, who's, I'm assuming, pretty low carb in general, maybe not in ketosis all the time, how do you feel about exogenous ketones, MCT oil, artificially spiking those while still maintaining a relatively low carb diet, but maybe not being in ketosis?
Yeah. I think, biohacking is something quite interesting. And I think for some people who don't want to go as low as keto, and they like their, you might say I'm on a low carb diet, but I like my starchy vegetables. I don't eat much fruit, but I do like my pumpkin and beetroot and parsnip. So my diet is not as low as as low in carb as people might think all the time. So should I be throwing some MCT oil in? I've got MCT oil and I use it every now and again. So people can do that. So they can kind of artificially create that status of having being in a ketogenic state without going as low carb as possible, and that absolutely can work. I think sometimes we live in this space where the pendulum just goes from one side to the other side. So we get high carb, very low fat diets and proponents of that, and then there's all the stuff around low carb, and then suddenly the pendulum swings and everyone's doing keto and putting MCT oil in their coffee, and they're eating lots of butter and cream to the extent that actually, I'm seeing a middle-aged woman getting fatter because they're putting MCT oil in their coffee, and you kind of lose sight of the basics. And you see this a lot, the whole pendulum swing. I mean, gosh, you see it in politics, which I don't want to talk about, but you certainly see it in diets. You get the carnivore versus vegan, and this pendulum is going back and forth. And sometimes I think we lose sight of the middle bit, where actually we've got just some basic principles of whole food, which we can apply to if you want to avoid animals, if you want to avoid plants, that kind of thing. If you want to tap into a little bit of ketosis, you can do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I don't like the word moderation because I think certainly dietitians get criticized for defaulting to the word moderation, which is like a stupid word like balanced diet. Moderation and balance, it's like a nothing word for people who can't make up their mind. But I do think that there is some value in bringing that pendulum swing back to front and center. So I don't have a problem with people using MCT oil, absolutely. I don't have a problem with people who want to biohack and use exogenous exogenous ketones to get that mental clarity, to get that kind of ketone signaling buzz that they want to get for periods of time. But the average individual who's just trying to lose weight and be healthy, it might not be appropriate.
All right. Well, for that average individual, real food, they're cutting down on carbs, maybe entering ketosis periodically, maybe including some intermittent fasting. What about general supplements to go along with that? Is that something you're a fan of?
I never used to be a fan of supplements. I think, dietitians are very conservative. That was the old me. I was very conservative, and I've certainly changed my philosophy substantially from 20 years ago. But I used to be we talk about food first. I used to be a kind of food only. And I think to think that you can get all your nutrients from food these days, just not sure that we can do that. And, I've written a couple of papers with some colleagues about modeling low carbohydrate diets and looking at nutrient availability in those kind of hypothetical plans. And a lot of those hypothetical plans are nutrient replete, which is great. But if you look at the amount of homework you have to do to create a well-formulated plan, and the ones that we've done have been modeled on, the average kind of 35-year-old male or female that has a certain weight, has a certain height, you've got to calculate the calories, and it typically works out to be about 2,500 to 3,000 calories that you should be having. And if it's beautifully formulated, then you should be able to get all the micronutrients that you need. But who actually eats like that? I mean, if we all ate like that, that would be marvelous, but we don't. And then, of course, you bring in intermittent fasting and you're missing meals here and there. Your nutrient intake is going to be even less. Then you throw in some mental health issues, and, our world is just not coping with this mental health crisis at the moment. And you think about the metabolic demand that brings, and the turnover of nutrients like B vitamins, magnesium, zinc, the turnover that's required for these enhanced mental health states. I just think supplementation is something that I've become a greater fan of, and I'm definitely a fan of protein powder. And that's because the priority of protein in certain ages and stages of life are really important. And I think sometimes getting it from food is just, you can get it from food. Absolutely. It's easily done on paper, but in reality, if you want to do it in a really, in a way that's considered high quality without, jumping at the protein, protein bars at every meal, I think protein powder is very, very good to supplement things like smoothies and, your breakfast meals to lift the protein. So again, not for everyone, but I'm a fan of protein supplementation for a lot of people. I'm also a fan of using a general, like a multivitamin, multi-mineral kind of super green type powder. And this is a personal thing. You can talk to, 20 different practitioners, and they'll give you 20 different opinions about what they value, what they don't value, what they use, what they don't use. I'm a big fan of powder. I think taking pills kind of just takes it to the next level. So you mix up those, green powders, and put them in some water, in still water or fizzy water. You have a glass with your dinner, and that increases your hydration. And it also just lifts your micronutrient load. And maybe you don't need to do it every day, but it's kind of a mini insurance policy that I think people could look at to make sure that they get enough micronutrients. We live with the RDIs. We call them RDIs, recommended daily intakes, or we actually call them NRVs, nutrient reference values. I think you guys call them recommended daily allowances. And those, the RDAs and RDIs are just fraught, and how they were developed were based on a principle of let's prevent deficiency. Let's look at the minimum amount you need to have to prevent deficiency. Do we want to live like that? Or do we want to live in optimal micronutrient status? So that's another question. And then the question of how our food is produced and what kind of micronutrient destruction do we have along the way in growing our food and processing our food and all that. I just think sometimes a supplement every now and again can be helpful. And then, of course, supplementation for people who have compromised in certain areas, like, iron and B12 are common ones. I think magnesium is an interesting supplement that a lot of people need to boost. It's so beneficial for so many things that I'm a fan, again, of magnesium powders for certain instances. So yeah, I think supplements definitely have their place much more so than I used to think.
So given that you highlighted the importance of at least considering a protein powder, how do you look at somebody figuring out how much of that macronutrient they need? Because we've talked about carbs in a general sense, bringing those down. We gave a ballpark area there between, say, 50 and 100 grams per day. But we need to make sure we're getting enough calories, having enough nutrition and sustenance in a day. We're bringing carbs down. Naturally, we're going to need to fill that with protein and fat to round things out. So when you look at protein, how do you go about figuring that macro out?
Yeah. So again, I'm very lucky. The clients that come to me are very nutrition literate, and I don't like to keep them dependent on me. It's not a great business model, but it's just, I'm an academic as well, so I'm not the business person from hell. But I like them to take ownership and actually understand food composition and understand what their diet should look like. So I make use of diet monitoring apps. I always ask, we always do this in negotiation. I say, how do you feel about this? And they go, oh yeah, I've used this one before and it's pretty good. I'm like, yep, you don't need to use it for the rest of your life, but to do your homework and to figure out what I'm talking about when I say have 60 grams of carbohydrate or 110 grams of protein, you need to do the homework. And they're typically open to that. So, I quite like an app which is New Zealand and Australian friendly, called Izzy Diet Diary. But you've got Chronometer, you've got Fat Secret, you've got MyFitnessPal, you've got all of them, and they've all got various pros and cons, I think. So I typically give my nutrition literate folk some thresholds for carbohydrate and some thresholds for protein. And I say that's the rest of your calories, really. So we don't really give a fat threshold for the majority. And the protein threshold, again, is worked out based on what their goal is, based on what their age and stage is. And then when we plan a diet, after we've talked about macros, we look at what 20 or 30 gram amounts of protein would look like in a meal. And I tell you, you're talking about misconceptions and preconceptions. When you say to somebody, I think you should have roughly 100, let's say round figure, 100 grams of protein a day, they automatically think of a 100-gram piece of steak. They'd get 100-gram piece of steak gives them 100 grams of protein, and that's the biggest misconception. It's like, but 100 grams of steak, which is about the palm of your hand, gives you around 30 or 35 grams of protein. And they go, oh, okay, suddenly see the world opening up. So between the protein kind of threshold or range or recommendation, we talk about whether it's animal protein or plant protein or a combination of both, how they can optimize their protein. We talk about protein quality as well. So again, I think you get a lot more, or in this country anyway, you get a lot more good quality protein powder products than you do protein bar products. I think a lot of the protein bars, the most delicious ones typically, have all sorts of things in them that you can't even pronounce or recognize. So you end up eating processed food. And one could argue that protein powder is also processed. We know this because at AUT, where I work as an academic, we are doing some studies on food quality and on categorizing different foods. Almost like you've probably heard of the NOVA system, classifying foods. We've developed something called the HIS, the Human Interference System scoring, and we're classifying foods according to the different level of processing. It's modified NOVA, and it's like you can't reconcile that processing and health are not synonymous, really, because your protein powder, good quality protein powder that's literally got whey protein powder and end of story, goes in the ultra processed food category, the same category as like Doritos. I'm like, that just does my head in. And there's a spectrum. It's such a complicated area, but I still maintain the belief that protein powders can be of greater quality. They have lesser ingredients. You can get a purer protein powder that you can bar. But of course, for omnivores, there's massive value in eating meat, fish, chicken, and eggs, because the nutrient profile you get from those foods are untouchable, really.
You mentioned whey protein. For somebody that's open to plant or animal, is that your go-to?
I'm not particularly loyal to any one particular brand or type of protein powder. I know what I like. I like whey protein powder because of the texture, and the brands that I get, I just I sort of become loyal to those for me. But when I'm talking to an individual and they are, can you recommend a protein powder? I say, yeah, you've got whey-based, you've got pea-based, you've got egg-based, you've got soy-based. Here are some of the kind of brands that I go for. you can order these online, or you can literally go into a shop and have a look at the label. If there's like more than 3 or 4 ingredients on the list, you might want to reconsider. But often when you talk to people, it's funny, they've got protein powder lying around. They have, most people. Either they've done it before, they've had some before, or, their son's trying to bulk up at the gym and they've got something. So it's find something that you like. I do, I know there's, slight differences between, isolates and concentrates and all that kind of stuff. And if you're talking to somebody who's an elite athlete, you might get more critical. But if you're talking to the general public, it's like, get something that's unprocessed, something you like the taste of, something that's not going to break the bank balance, and go with that.
Somebody that's hearing us talk about bringing down carbs and intermittent fasting might be saying, naturally, we're going to have less fiber in the diet. And then that brings up the gut microbiome piece. Talk about how you think about fiber in the microbiome.
Okay, so that's an interesting topic. The first thing I wanted to say, I mentioned a paper that I published several years ago with some colleagues in Australia, and that was modeling a low carbohydrate diet to look at nutrient sufficiency, I guess. And that was the one I was mentioning. I think we had like 2,600 calories worth in a female plan. And we managed to produce a few kind of sample meals that were well formulated. So they were, a lot of thought went into them, a lot of planning went into them. We didn't use foods that I think are great, like liver, but most people don't like, to optimize the nutrients. We used kind of general foods, and we didn't go crazy on the vegetables, but we just basically had, if there was a salad for lunch and a meal for dinner that included protein and vegetables, we used nuts and seeds. It was minimal fruit, but there was some fruit. And the fiber was, I think it came up to be about 44 grams in the day. And it was greater than when you would look at obviously standard American diet would be dire. But if you looked at your general guidelines, create a diet, it would supersede that, and it would certainly supersede the recommended daily allowance, which is about 25 grams per day. So if you're particular about your diet, if you include some vegetables, lots of non-starchy vegetables, some starchy vegetables, again, if you're doing keto, then you can't really use many starchy vegetables, but you've got lots of non-starchy vegetables in there. You've got nuts and seeds, probably got psyllium husk if you're making your own breads and things. Fiber is not a problem. So that's a really important point that I want to get across. People think it's a problem, but it's actually not a problem. There is another school of thought that, and this is in the keto space, and it's just a proposal for now. It hasn't been tested, and I'm not sure how we can do that. But a diet that is totally devoid of fiber, like the carnivore diet as an example, you could say, well, fiber's got these links to risks of bowel cancer and all these kind of things. It's really important for the microbiome. There's no fiber, you're doing yourself a disservice. And if you look at what fiber does and how the microbes feed, you've got butyrate, which is one of the key short-chain fatty acids that you get from fiber, which is the main fuel for the bugs that live in your gut. And the theory is, if you don't provide that fuel, the bugs are going to suffer. The theory around being in ketones and having a high level of circulating ketones is that one of the key ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate, has a similar chemical structure to butyrate. And there is a theory that this could be a microbiome benefit, and that you don't actually need it from fiber. You can get the benefit from those circulating ketones. So that's the theory. I'm not saying you necessarily need to cut out all the vegetables to test the theory or anything. But we know that whenever you change your diet, whether you change it from an omnivore to a vegetarian to a vegan to a carnivore to Mediterranean diet to a pescatarian, whatever, your microbiome changes. And it changes very quickly. It takes about 48 hours for your microbiome to change and adapt. And we know a lot more than we used to know about the microbiome, but we still know very, very little about the microbiome and its kind of it's dietary prescription to optimize microbiome and health longer term. We're sort of feeling our way there. So number one, you can have enough fiber if you want to, and I think people do need to prioritize vegetables. And number two, if you are for whatever reason on the carnivore diet, then potentially you can look into this theory a little bit more and make up your own mind about it.
Given that you're in this low carb space / keto, somebody that is drawn to your work and comes to work with you and they're all for going on a carnivore diet to fix their metabolic health, to lose weight quickly, what do you say to them? It sounds like you're not totally sold on it, but are you in support of it? How would you guide somebody if you were working with them and they wanted to go that route?
So I have to be honest, I'm not a fan if you want to do carnivore for weight loss. I'm not a fan if you want to do carnivore for improving metabolic health or, as someone with type 2 diabetes. Can you get good outcomes and good results? Absolutely, you can. But I think it would be in the spectrum of things I would do, it would be the last thing. It's sort of the AIP diet, which you might have come across, the autoimmune protocol diet, which is a diet that is recommended for people with autoimmune conditions, which is very, very extreme. I think that would be the second most extreme diet. The carnivore diet would be the most extreme diet, I think, and I think it's very hip right now, very popular. We actually, myself and some colleagues from New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa, we're actually writing a paper on nutrient availability and nutrient concerns, not necessarily negative, but just general nutrient issues on carnivore diet. And we're going to submit that for publication soon. But I think that if somebody comes to me and they've gone, I've done this, I've done that, I've got severe arthritis or severe gut issues, and I've tried all these things, I've tried whole food, got a little bit better, but not quite, and they've done all the things that I would normally put them on, and they go, I've been hearing about this carnivore diet, what do you reckon? I'd say, it might be an option. It might be an option. So I have had some clients on the carnivore diet that I've supported, and some have got a lot of joy out of it, and a lot of, I don't mean joy, but I mean metabolic joy. They have found that it has helped them a lot, and some that haven't. So I am in support when it's a negotiated process and when the condition is right. But I do get concerned when I hear about people doing it when they don't have to do it. I think doing anything for a trial is pretty cool. Like you do a keto trial for a month, you do a carnivore trial for a month, bearing in mind that the microbiome changes, and just be careful what you wish for, because you don't really know what's going to happen when you come back. So I think trying things, is useful, but unless you are prepared to do this for life, you just need to be a bit careful what you go with. So yes, I'm in support, but not as a blanket rule.
Got it.
I think interesting, just on that point, I just want to say one more thing. With something like severe either autoimmune or arthritic conditions or severe gut health issues, I've had people that have had that have experienced extreme benefit from removing all their plants. So in other words, going carnivore. But I've also had people that have had extreme benefit when they've removed all the animals. So they've gone vegan. So, and that's where you've got this, vegan versus carnivore camp, and everyone's screaming at each other. I think there is value in just recognizing that the individual is truly the individual. And sometimes you need to navigate through a few pathways to find out what works for that individual. Everyone's metabolic makeup is very different. And we're beginning to understand more about hormones and neurotransmitters and all that kind of stuff, and microbiome, but really we have no idea how diverse people are internally.
It's interesting you bring up that piece of going extreme, either all for plants or all for meat. It's something I think about quite often. And it does seem like those are the two camps. When somebody gets a chronic disease such as cancer or something really severe, they tend to gravitate towards one of those. And this is only through the internet. You hear a lot of success stories in both those realms. So it's interesting you bring that up.
Yeah. And it's something like, cancer's a tricky one because, oh gosh, you've got this context there, which is like nothing else. So, the sustainability of it is not really a question. It's just like, if you want to do this. But also, like, outside of the cancer space, I think people can have a lot of benefit from looking at their life. And I think stress plays a massive, intangible role in chronic disease development progression. The impact on the mitochondrial health when the mitochondria goes rogue. It's just a big unknown, and I just think, I think stress has a massive part to play. I mean, over the years, when chronic disease has increased, a lot of things have changed. The food supply has changed. Our physical activity has changed, but I don't think as much really as our food supply. Our modern life has changed. We are so busy doing all sorts of things at all sorts of hours, double jobs, running families. Then we've got, devices and social media and all that kind of stuff. We've got pollutants and additives and all that. And then, you can go into all those other environmental concerns as well. And these are the things that have been changing over time. And we can't really put our finger on one thing. And maybe it isn't one thing, but I do believe stress is underappreciated in terms of the damage it can do. People first want to go with, let me change my diet, and I know I need to get more active, and what supplements can I take to make myself better? And it's actually, well, if you just do some nose breathing every day, that might be the thing that gets you right. So, I just think the importance of that is really big.
Well, the challenging thing about stress is it's more subjective, where coming back to diet and supplements, you can look back at that at the end of the day and see exactly what you took or what you ate and assess whether you did a good job in that realm. Stress, like you said, social media, all these different inputs throughout the day, it's very gray and it's very hard to assess where you're at on that spectrum and then to make changes that are black and white. And then also to throw another layer to that is hormetic stress. Things like fasting or exercise, where saunas, cold plunges, where we know stress in the right dose at the right time actually has a benefit. So there's a lot there, and it's a lot more gray and harder to unpack and make meaningful change in that realm, I would say.
Oh, 100%. It's very complex. And I think, you hit the nail on the head, hormetic stress or acute versus chronic stress. I think the definition of stress is probably the next thing that will come through for people to talk about, because I just don't think that's got any airtime. Maybe it's just nothing really known. I know we've got the acute versus chronic, but what does that actually mean? Is the stress of a busy day, is it actually is it damaging, or is it that chronic stress? Is it death of a loved one? Is it that kind of stress? Is it financial stress? Is it that there's just so many things in there. How do you define stress that's going to be? We know what stress is going to be harmful, but we're not entirely sure about the the extent of and the level of the helpful stress. Classic example. So CGMs, right? Continuous glucose monitors are brilliant. And they're going to just go boom. It'll be the next device to go boom. It's already going boom beyond the diabetic world. I don't think, if you look at, when I wore a CGM when I was first testing it several years ago, the idea is to keep your blood sugar nice and stable, like flatline as much as you can, really, while being alive, obviously. And I remember doing various things, and I always go for a swim in the ocean after I run. Now, it's quite different to a cold plunge. Depends where you live in the world and what time of the year, but I remember I was wearing a CGM and it was in May, so that was sort of the turn of the seasons. It was getting colder. It was Easter weekend, and I went for a swim after my run. I looked at my CGM pattern at the end, and my greatest spike was when I did my swim after my run, and that's hormetic stress. But do we actually know that? Do we have any signs to show if you're doing cold plunges regularly, if you're getting these big spikes in blood sugar, is that actually a good thing or not a good thing? We don't know, and we could hazard a guess. Maybe it's an acute thing. We don't know, but we're so fixated on how beneficial cold plunges will be. And this was in the ocean in New Zealand in May. I mean, let's face it, it wasn't like the icy lakes of Canada. And it wasn't a cold plunge pool where you've got ice, where I would imagine the response would be enormous. Is that good for you long-term, regularly? You don't know. There's so much we don't know. Sorry about that random story. I just thought I'd throw it in.
No, that's a good entrance into metabolic health as a whole, as you're talking about blood sugar levels. And this ties back to the weight loss piece at the beginning, but a slight pivot. Let's talk about metabolic health as a whole now. This again fits into low carb, weight loss, chronic disease as a whole, but regulating that blood sugar and then its role in elevating insulin if we're spiking that, and then chronic disease.
Yeah, so again, insulin and glucose, those are, two massive conversations. And I think we've been so glucose-centric to date. And insulin is starting to make inroads into research, into conversations. A PhD student that I had several years ago, myself and Professor Grant Schofield, who I work with, we had a PhD student who's now Dr. Catherine Crofts, and she did some of the foundation work around hyperinsulinemia. So she connected with the late Dr. Joseph Kraft, who had basically this massive database of his life work, looking at glucose and insulin 5-hour patterns, so insulin assays, which is kind of unheard of, really. And he'd written this book, and no one had ever heard of him, and he was in his 90s, and Catherine contacted him, and he sent her this database on like these floppy disks. People don't even know what that is. And she got the data, she did all this analysis, and found that out of the 5 Kraft patterns of insulin status after a meal postprandially, so he did glucose and insulin responses, and basically found that in about 2/3 of these individuals that had normal glucose tolerance after a meal had impaired insulin, and that would never be discovered in modern day medicine. You have a glucose tolerance test and your glucose goes up and it comes down nicely. Sweet, you're good. Come back in 5 years' time for another checkup. Meanwhile, your insulin is bubbling away, taking a long time to come down. And while it's bubbling away on high levels, it's creating damage in the body. It's creating inflammation and oxidative stress, and it's basically everything it's kind of touching, and in a chronic sense, is causing problems in the different systems of the body, and the pathologies of disease are being are ruminating without doctors actually knowing that the patient is actually on their way to disease. So, this work is continuing. I think this is moving into practice a little bit. There are some practitioners that are doing it like condensed, like 2-hour insulin essays after a meal, because they can tell a lot about metabolic status. But acute insulin is important as well. It's actually an anti-inflammatory, whereas chronically it's inflammatory. So it's complicated, and of course measuring insulin is just fraught. It's like one of the most labile hormones there is. So again, when you measure fasting insulin, you go, oh yeah, fasting insulin is normal. But actually, if you measured it, if you took 10 measures in the next hour, you might have 10 different comments about the metabolic status of that individual. So the diagnostics are not quite there yet, and there's work that's being done to progress the science there. But insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, so elevated levels of insulin in the blood are disease causing, disease promoting, and how do we keep insulin high? Carry on eating carbohydrates. How do we bring insulin down? Reduce the sugary food that does that. We know that protein and fat also has an ability to raise insulin, but nowhere near the extent that glucose does. So it's a really, really important area that is gaining a lot more traction now.
And in a practical sense, given what you just said there, what is somebody to do? It sounds like the testing is, we know it's not part of a standard protocol for a medical doctor. Even the fasting insulin isn't necessarily enough to tell us what's going on. So given all that, is it enough just to go lower carb and assume that insulin levels are coming down? How do we go about assessing our metabolic health, given what you just shared there?
Yeah, and that can be complicated or can be quite simple. Doing your, it can be complicated. Doing your standard, panel where you get your lipids, your blood lipids are so open to interpretation, the whole total cholesterol LDL debacle, which is playing out. But things like triglycerides, in the lipid panel, triglycerides and HDL are solid markers to look at. I mean, combined with, your blood pressure and your waist circumference and your weight and all these things together are important to look at metabolic health. I think if you've got something like excess body fat, potentially you could assume that there's some insulin resistance there, and you could benefit from reducing your carbohydrate. Again, it doesn't need to be, I need to go keto. It's, you can come down from 200 to 100, and you're not changing your life substantially. What else? I think in a pregnancy situation, like every woman who's pregnant gets a glucose tolerance test, but they don't get an insulin tolerance test. We've just had a PhD student come through. She's just about to get a PhD, so she will soon be Dr. Sylvia Goodacre. And she's done her PhD looking at exploring these concepts in the insulin space. So it was a challenging PhD in that she's taken concepts from diabetes, what we've known about type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and brought it into the pregnancy space where insulin resistance is a normal and natural context of pregnancy. But what compounds things is, what about people going into pregnancy if there are women who have pre-existing metabolic dysfunction, so they might have high levels of insulin circulating, they might have insulin resistance, but you'd never know it because they are, for all intents, reasonably slim. Obviously, if they have excess body fat, there's some assumptions you can make, but if they're reasonably slim, you would think nothing of it. And then all of a sudden, you've got the pregnancy state where you've got natural insulin resistance now superimposed on pre-existing. And you've got the perfect storm, and then you've got gestational diabetes, and then, blah, blah, blah. So I think there are various places where we can intervene, but I do think the look into insulin postprandially and the diagnostics there, if that moved forward, that would be a bit of a breakthrough, I think, in terms of diagnostics of metabolic health.
So for the average person, though, if they're not overweight and they're doing a lot of what we said today, lowering the carbs and moderating those and living a generally healthy lifestyle, is that enough? Or would you say that the average person should get some kind of testing done periodically to assess where they are metabolically?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I sort of toggle between, get your standard bloods and a few bits and pieces once every now and again, versus, you can over-test, and it's, be careful what you find or what you wish for. You might find something which is kind of, I don't know, like the microbiome testing is classic. You do stool tests and things, and you find stuff which might not actually be a problem, but on the interpretive panel at the time, it looks like it's potentially a problem. So you end up having to spend, take out a mortgage to buy 12 months worth of supplements to sort things, and which might never have been a problem in the first place. But I think, like, as you say, I'm on a relatively low carb diet. I'm not perfect. I have my moments. I exercise regularly, and that's a non-negotiable for me. Non-negotiable. I don't over-exercise, because that can be inflammatory in itself. So finding the balance of what I do and how often and how much is important. And when I do eat carbohydrates, because I certainly do, any one of my friends listening to this will shoot me if I say I'm on a ketogenic diet. They've seen it. My weight does not change. So I am metabolically well regulated. I'm very insulin sensitive, but that might change tomorrow. Like I don't know. I don't know. At some point, stuff happens in your body, and it might be the menopause time where you become more insulin resistant, and then everything turns to custard. I have lots of clients that go, "Oh, I used to be as slim as you, and now I've got this tie around my stomach." So, like, things can change at any moment. But if you can eat carbohydrate and you don't put on weight, and you are doing everything that you need to do, then you can semi-safely say that you are insulin sensitive. And you can try and live your life to make sure that you retain that benefit of insulin sensitivity by doing all those things, eating well, exercising well, managing your stress, getting out in the sunshine, having lots of, being immersed in your community, having lots of friendships and all that kind of stuff. It's like the blue zone type of scenario. If you can live a full life in those respects, then you're doing the best. You're doing the best for yourself. I mean, look, you talk about diagnostics. There is that controversy between, the LDL cholesterol and does that cause issues with heart disease? And then you've got your calcium score now. You can have a calcium score test and actually see how much calcium buildup, which is indicative of plaques that build up in your arteries. And the two are not, they don't align. You can have a very high LDL and a zero calcium score, and vice versa. So potentially from a cardiovascular perspective, having a calcium score might be something that you can do. And if you are metabolically sensitive, I'm not always convinced you'll have a calcium score of zero. Don't know. That's a bit of an unknown there. I'd like to think so, but we've got the family history coming in there, and we still don't know. We don't know enough about that to say, no, if you're slim and you do all the right things, then that's you.
Coming back to the exercise piece, for somebody that wants to include that, which they should, to maintain metabolic health, to maintain general health, how do they go about constructing that? What should they want? What should they make sure they include in that plan?
So when you look at how the science and the practice of exercise and how it's morphed over the last several years, there's a great understanding about how lots of intense or long duration exercise is not actually good for you long term. So if you're running marathon or ultra marathon after ultra marathon after ultra marathon, you are going to get some protective effect from being an active individual, but the oxidative stress that it causes might not be the best thing. And then you get HIIT came in, so high intensity interval training came in, CrossFit and F45 and jumping around like a mad thing for 45 minutes. And, you get a lot of, say, females getting towards menopausal area or times, and they want to drop some weight. So they do F45. So they jump around with their 18-year-old colleagues in the class, and they just cause inflammation. Their cortisol goes up, and stress hormones, and they just don't get anywhere. So I think exercise should be very contextual to your age and stage. When you're young, you can get away with a lot, and I think when you're young, doing things like more extreme exercise, like the CrossFits and the marathon running, it's great for forming an exercise, a lifelong exercise desire, and I would encourage that. But as you get older, things change. So I think, coming back to your question, what is the most important, what's the most relevant combination? I would say definitely doing something for your cardiovascular health. So that can be running, biking, walking, swimming, or dancing, or team sports, or whatever. If you have never been a runner and you are, 55 years of age, probably not the best time to start running. But it's all sort of contextualized to what you do. So if you used to be an endurance cyclist and you're getting older, there's a lot of change to e-bikes. You can still get a reasonable workout on an e-bike if you are honest about it. But you can always do some cardiovascular exercise and brisk walking. And I'm a real, I'm sort of guilty of thinking if you're not running, if you're walking, you can't, just doesn't cut it. You've got to be running to get anything out of it. I'm not into walking. And I've recently taken up golf. And, I'm a very, very quick walker. I don't muck around. And especially you don't muck around on a golf course because there's etiquette. And man, 18 holes of golf. There's some hills, and when you're walking, especially with me, you're walking zigzagging, trying to find my ball, because I'm not that good at this stage. It's a great workout, and it can give you cardiovascular fitness. So cardiovascular type of exercise is really good. Anywhere from 20 minutes to a few hours on the golf course is cool. Resistance training is key. I can't sell the concept enough. And I think, again, for that middle-aged sort of male and female counterpart, it is crucial to try and build or create as much muscle as you can to put yourself in good stead for a healthy future. So that can be things like, joining a Pilates class, reformer or mat Pilates, or it can be like lifting some stuff in your garage. It can be moving your body. I think of the push-up as being the classic example of lifting weights without owning any of them, because you're lifting your body weight. Same with tricep dips. You're lifting your body, and the heavier you are, the more you're lifting. So there are different ways and means, and I think it should be a non-negotiable to get some resistance training. And I know that there's certain sort of health influencers and leaders that talk about rucking, putting weights in a rucksack and walking downhill. and walking. I think it's brilliant. I think it's really brilliant. And anything you can do to lift stuff in a way that's not going to stress your body to the point of, you do want to stress your body, but you don't want to stress your body to the point of injury. That's going to be really important. So that combination of cardiovascular and resistance exercise is a must.
In tying this exercise piece to going low carb, somebody who is on the spectrum from weekend warrior all the way to more elite athlete, and they're worried about bringing their carbs down as a source to fuel their exercise, talk about how there's some myth in that to be dispelled. I know this is an area that you have expertise in, and the common knowledge is that we need carbs to fuel that exercise. So talk about why that isn't so.
Yeah, so I think historically we've been taught that carbohydrate is the main fuel of exercise, and all the research and all the practice has been very much governed around that whole carb-centric model. And carbohydrate is a fuel of exercise, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the main fuel of exercise. We know that fat is an incredibly powerful fuel of exercise. It's more calorie dense. There's a lot more energy per gram of fat than there is per gram of carbohydrate. We know that the stores in the body are way greater for fat than they are for carbohydrate. Even in the leanest individual has lots of fat calories on them, whereas most people only have about 500-ish grams of carbohydrate that they store in their liver and their muscles at any one time. So the theory around needing to rely solely on carbohydrate has been challenged, and I mean it was challenged in the 80s and even earlier. Some of the studies that were done. And metabolic flexibility is coming through as being an important term. So how about, instead of being so reliant on carbohydrate, how about let's become more reliant on using fat as a fuel? And potentially we can see different fuel utilization while you exercise, which is true. We do see that. If you eat less carbs and more fat, and you exercise and you analyze it via gas exchange, you see that you do use more fat as a fuel source. It's a matter of do you see an improved performance on low carb compared to high carb? And that's where the literature and the studies are playing out now. I think it makes a lot of sense in the endurance world. When you're looking at endurance or ultra endurance, like people become slaves to carbohydrate, and you constantly have to, have 50 to 60 to 70 to 80 grams of carbohydrate on the hour every hour. If you're doing that in an Ironman, wow, there's a lot of carbohydrate. Your dentist is going to be very, very unhappy with you, as well as lots of other things that potentially are not healthy. So in the endurance space, it makes a lot of sense, and you can perform quite easily on low carb. And again, the most important thing there is that adaptation period. You can't go from high carb to a low carb in a couple of weeks and expect to feel and perform as well. So you've got to appreciate the fact that adaptation, mitochondrial adaptation to different fuel partitioning and utilization is crucial. And you're not going to do this adaptation in your key training season. If you're an elite athlete, you're going to do it in the off season. And you're going to trial it. You're going to see what works, what doesn't work. You're going to get your body composition right, and go from there. So that at the moment, the literature is playing out quite nicely. There's a little bit of argy-bargy around energy exercise economy. So there are two schools of thought there around potentially low-carb diets impair running economy. And there are some studies that are going on at the moment to try and try and see what's going on there. So, two schools of thought there. In the intermittent exercise space, the literature that's coming through is really interesting, because you could argue that in that space and in the kind of resistance training space, the types of exercise that you do are more glycolytic in nature. They demand more glucose and glycogen being used as a fuel source, because they are, high intensity. They draw on that first and second energy system where you use glucose or glycogen carbohydrate. Whereas for endurance exercise, you've got that third energy system where you can utilize fat more efficiently. So back to the high intensity stuff, you can go, well, it's more glycolytic, so you need more carbohydrate. But actually the studies are interesting. They're showing that low carb diets do not necessarily show a worsening performance. They can actually compete in terms of having equivalent performance. So if you are a high carb athlete and you can perform well doing high intensity work, and you're a low carb athlete and you can perform just as well, then that becomes a good choice, because you might not get an enhanced performance, but you don't get a reduced performance. So if I was an athlete and I didn't get a reduced performance, I know where I'd go. I don't want to be a slave to carbohydrate. I don't want that inflammation, oxidative stress, glycation happening all the time. If I can be a low carb athlete and have optimal blood sugar regulation and stand my body in good stead for optimal health longer term, I certainly know what I'd be doing. So that's kind of where the literature is. I think, you asked earlier about perceptions. People perceive that without carbohydrate, they would be sluggish, won't be able to move. And that's not true, but it does need an adaptation period to realize that. And I think a lot of the criticism around low carb has come from either people or researchers that have not allowed that adaptation period to happen. So they go, oh, you see, it doesn't work. We'll get a reduced performance. Well, actually, let's do it properly. Let's look at, good quality diets, good quality adaptation periods and go from there. So it's an interesting
tricky
science.
Variable with that adaptation period. For somebody that does adapt and does it in a healthful way, how long would that take?
Yeah, that's a great question. I once had an athlete come and see me, and he was training for this ultra marathon event, and I think it was the one in the Death Valley one, or one of the ones in the US with the high levels of heat. And he came to me, it was like 2 months before, and he's like, right, I've heard about this low carb thing. I'm really keen to try it. I'm like, cool. I just don't think now's the right time, because you've got your event coming up. 2 months, all I would do is really improve the quality of your food and optimize your electrolytes and hydration. At this point, I'd be too nervous. It's too soon. And he totally ignored me, because he said, look, well, I'm going to do it anyway, so tell me about it. So I'm like, okay, we've got to support this guy. And he was fine. He did brilliant performance, and he didn't suffer from not being fat adapted. So his makeup showed one thing, but other people need to adapt for a good 6 to 8 months before they can get the true benefit of being, metabolically flexible. So again, we come back to the individuality of the individual, and that's why studies they're important to do, but practice is important to look at as well. I know it's anecdotal evidence, but it's also important anecdotal evidence to help move the science in its entirety forward. That individuality needs to be respected.
And we could take that and apply it to earlier in our discussion when we were talking about lowering carbs in a general sense and having a period of time to become metabolically flexible, transitioning quickly or taking our time. And yeah, I could see how that is applicable in that sense as well, where people are used to every couple hours having that top up of carbs throughout the day as snacks and relying on that because that's what they've trained their body to do.
Yeah. And I also just wanted to mention that the practical exercise context is really important as well. So it's not a matter of just being high carb or low carb. I think the metabolic flexibility and being able to cycle your carbs and maybe pad up some of those heavier training sessions with carbs once you adapted, and potentially the event itself, train in a state of high carbohydrate availability while you've adapted to low carbohydrate availability has adaptive and performance benefits as well. So again, we have the science isn't guiding us there. The practice is guiding us there. I've had lots of clients that have thrived in, say, keto space, even with resistance training, performance sports. But over time, they find that they just, on certain sessions, they just feel a little bit better if they put some carbs in. Now, that doesn't mean, like a sandwich with 10 slices of bread, squashed together. We're talking about anywhere between 30 to 40 grams of carbohydrate in a recovery meal. Some people just feel a little bit better. That's still a low carbohydrate diet, but it's not as low. So I think within the low carbohydrate spectrum, there's still a lot of learning that we need to do in terms of what's optimal for individuals. That carb cycling hopefully is the next round of research methodologies we might see to help guide us, but maybe we look more towards practice, because I certainly know what I would do with athletes on a practical sense. I don't think I've ever seen that in a study methodology, because it's just impossible to do, really, at this point.
How do you feel about fasted exercise? Tying back to intermittent fasting, you mentioned the fact that you've taken up golf. Say you went out and played 18 holes without food in the morning. Talk about any benefits you could get there if you don't have food in your system, fat burning and beyond.
I've actually done that. And I don't find that problematic. I think because I'm metabolically flexible, going without food is not really a problem. In fact, sometimes when I do eat food during golf, I go, why did I eat that? Because now I'm hungrier. Now I need more. Just eating this, now I need more. Whereas if you go without food, you just feel like you don't need any. And I do think you get that mental clarity. Some people like having the feel of food in their system. Some people like to train feeling a little bit fuller. Some people like to train on empty. So again, it's very individual. I think fasted training is probably something which is gaining more momentum in the mainstream space to make athletes more metabolically flexible in an acute way. So if you like it, the mainstreamers who are against going low carb or going on the ketogenic diet chronically still believe in the benefits and obviously realize the benefits of being metabolically flexible. So they use small or acute tools to make the athlete more metabolically flexible. One of those is fasted training. One of those is also not replacing your carbohydrate after one training session when you've got another one later on in the day. So basically creating an environment in the body which runs on low carbohydrate availability to get those upregulation and adaptive mechanisms for optimal fat and fuel utilization. So they kind of go, well, we don't think you should go on the low carb diet, but here are a bunch of strategies that you can do acutely to get you more fat adapted. Interesting. So, there are various ways and means of getting there. But I think fasted training is something that a lot of athletes do. Interestingly, in the old days, I remember when I was working with some high performance athletes, particularly triathletes, and I was banging on about importance of having, 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate before exercise, and they would just train on empty. And it's interesting. So I was trying to undo some of the good adaptive work because of what the mainstream textbook kind of was telling me to say to athletes. And, in hindsight, looking back, these athletes were at the top of their game, yet they were just ignoring all the advice that I was giving them as a mainstream dietitian back in the day. So, you can get lots of benefits. I think there's always an element of just being cautious and listening to your body. I know that sounds weird to some people. Again, 20 years ago, I would have thought that sounded very fringe and very, woo-woo when you say listen to your body. But now I think it's crucial. And when I'm working with an athlete, I always say, you know your body like a million times better than I'm ever going to know your body. You know how you feel more than I'm ever going to know how you feel. So listen to that and work out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And sometimes with things like that, when you're working out what does work for you, you do need to experience what doesn't work for you. So you need to fail when you try certain things and then go, well, I'm not doing that again. So a classic one could be if you do too much intermittent fasting. So you've got to be careful that you don't fail to the point that you've your hair's fallen out and your hormones are going crazy. You've just got to feel that something's not quite right and not go any further. So yeah, it's a fine line and balance, and I think between knowing your body, working with a professional who knows both contexts, is very important. I think forums with what other people are doing are good, but they can be harmful as well, because like they doing that, it works for them, it must work for me too, and that doesn't always happen.
Talk about your transition from being a mainstream dietitian to where you are today. And then talk about pressure you've had along that journey.
Oh gosh, how long have we got? Okay, I'm going to condense it. So probably about just over 10 years ago, I made the transition, and it sort of came about from the whole kind of in the diabetes, kind of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia space. And it started really when we had Catherine, our PhD student, and I was brought on as a supervisor, as a skeptic supervisor, so the disruptive one. With my food groups and my healthy whole grains and my carbohydrates all stored up in my brain for conversation. And then a colleague of mine was saying, let's explore insulin resistance and let's look at what it is, and this is what hyperinsulinemia is. And in diabetes, you get typically type 2 diabetes, you have insulin resistance, and we're all in agreement, and this is all nice and collegial. And then my colleague says to me, well, then why do dietitians prescribe moderate to high carbohydrate diets to manage type 2 diabetes, a condition where you can't actually manage your carbohydrates well? And it's such a simple question, and I was absolutely stumped. And that's when I kind of, I'm like, oh, I'll come back to you on that one. And I kind of wanted to say, well, there's 4 food groups, and you need all your micronutrients. You need to get your fiber and your B vitamins from all your whole grains and fruit, and all the stuff that as a mainstream dietitian I would come out with. That one question kind of just floored me a little bit, and then I was a dietitian who poo-pooed Atkins when it came out, and then at the same time, Professor Tim Noakes from South Africa was talking a lot about low carb diets, and he taught me when I went through my undergrad physiology degree in Cape Town, and I had a lot of respect for him. He was a very noisy man in terms of if he had something to say, he would say it no matter what the consequences, and that first played out in the area of hypernatremia, when we had those, hyponatremia, where we had in an endurance athlete context, people were drinking according to the guidelines, which were, 750 mils on the hour every hour. And after Ironman, people were getting hyponatremia, so very low sodium and, potentially fatal if not treated. And he came out years before about this concept of the guidelines are wrong, you've got to drink to thirst. And I remember as a mainstream dietitian going, that's nonsense. If you're thirsty, you're really dehydrated. That's what we've all been taught, and blah, blah, blah. And then fast forward a few years, and the ACSM guidelines for fluid changed towards that drink to thirst, and he was right. So when I heard him back being noisy about carbohydrates and about fat and about this whole area of low carb diets and insulin resistance, you just can't ignore a top rated scientist. And I thought, well, this in my questioning around insulin resistance and carbohydrate metabolism, I just need to think about this a lot more. And that's when it all happened. And I was really, I was kind of in two minds about carrying on as a dietitian, because these conversations were playing out sort of November, December, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm not sure I can do this anymore now. The old cliche of once you see something, you can't unsee it, and once you hear something, you can't unhear it. And that was really powerful. And I thought I need to go away over the Christmas holiday and think about things. And my colleague said, well, why don't you try low carb over Christmas? I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, have you seen what my neighbors bring to nibbles and things? Anyway, so I tried it and thought, actually, this can be done. And I read and I read and I read and I read more, and I read the work that I had seen in the past, but just turned a blind eye to. And that kind of started me on my journey. And I do remember the first time I had someone in my office, and I was talking to them about having full-fat milk and using butter. And I was just thinking, oh, my God, like I'm going mad. This is not actually happening. And then when you start seeing the positive outcomes, the way that people's health changed after that was just the momentum, along with the science that kept on coming through, the momentum to keep going, this is actually right. We actually got it wrong. And if you look back to the 50s, the diet that was promoted for diabetes was pretty much a whole food, low carb diet. I don't know where we went wrong with that, but we went from being right to then being wrong, and we're trying to now right the wrongs. So that was the kind of transition, which was very scary. And I got absolutely annihilated in the dietetic space. Complaints came in by my friends and colleagues, dietitians, about stuff that I was doing. And I had a complaint from the Australian Dietetics Association. The entire body of the Australian group complained against me. Interesting, fast forward 10 years, and the Australian Dietitians Association has just signed a collaboration. They've just established a collaboration with a group called Defeat Diabetes, doing low carb program. So, things have moved, and I guess I just became kind of academically resilient, and whenever I had a complaint, it was actually a great opportunity I had to rebut it. That was the process. Otherwise I'd be kicked out. It was a great opportunity to rebut it with good science and to make the case of, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. And the dietetics board was really reasonable. Complaint would come in, I'd address it, and then it would, it wouldn't eventuate to anything, which was great. Interestingly, the last complaint I had was last year. Like, I was complaint free for about 7 years. Right, we had 4 or 5 at the start, and then nothing. As low carb traveled towards mainstream, and then last year I had this complaint from a dietitian in New Zealand who was doing their PhD. Of all things, in doing a PhD, the one thing you become good at is is literature reviewing and critiquing literature. And she complained about my involvement with low carb diets for diabetes, because we know there's no evidence to suggest that low carb diets are good for managing type 2 diabetes. I'm like, my God, this woman is living under a rock. So the rebuttal was quite easily done. I cited all the evidence. I cited the fact that half of the world's diabetes guidelines have actually endorsed carbohydrate reduction as a therapeutic approach. New Zealand is trailing behind in that respect. And also told them that, well, our government, our Health Research Council has supported our group with a research grant to look at type 2 diabetes and low-carb diets in primary care. So they've put their money behind us after 6 years of applying for grants and getting the thumbs down. So, it's still coming in. That one was, of course, squashed quite quickly because the evidence now stands totally on its own for benefit. So that was the transition. There's still a lot of work to do. There are a lot of people coming on board, but there's still a lot of criticism. There's still a lot of lack of understanding. And admittedly, there is still science that needs to advance, particularly around lipidology and around LDL cholesterol, because that's one of the main barriers, really. We know that from a nutrient perspective, if you go low carb, you can just get your micronutrients from other foods. I mean, if you're good at, understanding foods and food composition, there's no problem. But the lipidology area is one that is moving nice. It's moving nicely from a scientific perspective, but it still needs to move further to convince a lot of the endocrinologists, really, around the space. So, yeah, that's the short story.
And dealing with these rebuttals and this, conflict in this realm, had you thought about just letting go of your credentials and continuing to write the books, doing the talks, having the consults? I'm just wondering why you would go through all that. Is it just because you spent so much time getting that education? You feel like you need to be a dietitian to be taken seriously and to help change things? I'm curious on that piece.
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think at the start, I thought a little bit about that. Like I'm a dietitian. I've earned it. I want to stay a dietitian. And then, when I think about it, well, okay, being a dietitian, a lot of my clients can claim health insurance if the health insurance covers. So there's that side of it. But we've also got the Nutrition Society. If you become a registered nutritionist, you can also have that benefit. So it wasn't solely about that. But then, over time, it just became apparent that, a profession is also an identity. And even though I don't see eye to eye with some of the dietitians and how they work, I am still a dietitian, and I know it might sound silly I don't know whoever's listening to this, saying I'm proud to be a dietitian, because, people don't say good, a lot of good things about dietitians these days. There is a lot of good stuff being said, but there's still some antagonism. But I still feel it's an identity that I want to be a part of. And I think if I could have some role at influencing, but helping the dietitians to move in this way, I think that would be really important. I haven't been very active in that space of late because I found that the efforts that I have made in the past are just tiresome when you just hit a brick wall. So I'm probably taking a break from that. And as I'm taking a break from that, guidelines for diabetes are changing around the world, and it's just a matter of time. And I think once that happens, there'll be a lot more openness towards this way of thinking. But I think now, probably the first time ever, if I got, they complained last year, I thought, if I get deregistered for this, then I'm going to make some serious noise about that, because that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Like, I'm guided by ethical principles, and ethical principles say you need to be guided by evidence-based, in evidence-based, and the evidence is there. So I don't think I would be thrown out for that, but if I was, I'd fight it. And if I got tired of that, I'd just let it go and go towards the clinical nutritionist route. So I care and I don't care, if you like.
Right. I guess part of the reason I'm so interested in that is because I had a career shift partway through my career and what I do. I was trained as a chiropractor, was in practice, used the DR title in front of my name. And then as this podcast grew and became what I do, I let that go and let my registrations go and all that stress, which will be at this point if I was still part of all that. So just curious on your thoughts and what keeps you in.
Yeah, it's definitely the identity and the fact that I'm persisting with the qualification, because I think dietitians have an incredibly important role to play. And I do think the role needs to be diversified, particularly now with health coaches as a vocation coming through, in primary care, in the private sector. Health coaches are coming through, and I think dietitians are feeling a little bit threatened about their role. And I think, yeah, I understand that, but I think the role needs to diversify so that the role is working with health coaches, and establishing a place for dietitians would be really important. And while I'm not being proactive to make that happen, if somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Caryn, do you want to work with us to move this forward and find a place for dietitians?" I'm like, "Yep, I'm your woman. I'll do it. I absolutely want to help." But I do also feel when I go to overseas conferences and the other dietitians and I meet them, I get a real kick out of that. It's like, yeah, this is our identity. This is our little group, and we're kind of fighting our way through, and we're making progress. And there's some satisfaction to that. It's not causing me the stress that maybe it might have caused you, as you were saying. And I think maybe if it did cause me stress, I'd let it go, because, I'm all for managing stress. But I think the benefits outweigh the stress at the moment. Like, if I have to respond to a complaint every now and again and just keep fighting, then, hey, I can do that.
Yeah. No, it didn't get to the point of stress for me. I just let it go for simplifying at that time. And I'm happy I did in my case. But Caryn, good for you. Keep fighting the good fight. We're going to link up your books, your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. It's been great chatting to you, and thanks for having me.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
If I put food into my mouth and it goes into my stomach and my GI tract, no matter what the food is, it's going to drive inflammation, because inflammation is the body's natural protection against foreign material. Fructose